We weren't even looking to buy in the Hollywood Hills. My wife, Natalie, and I were living in Pasadena with our 2 kids, renting a perfectly fine craftsman-style house near Caltech. But then the email came in from our realtor, a listing that hadn't hit the public market yet. A small but charming mid-century home nestled off Mulholland Drive, once owned by comedian and actor Fred Willard. That Fred Willard? Natalie asked, raising an eyebrow. From Best in Show? Yes, that one. The house had been in his name until his passing in 2020. Since then, it had reportedly sat mostly empty, occasionally rented to people in the industry but never permanently owned again. Something about that struck me as odd, but we chalked it up to LA real estate weirdness and the fact that old celebrity homes often carried baggage, if not literal ghosts, then inflated prices or legal tangles. This house was different. It was priced fairly, maybe even too fairly, and had views of Laurel Canyon, a cozy sunken living room with floor-to-ceiling windows, and a detached guest studio Fred used as his writing space. It had a soul. You could feel it the moment you walked in. Not fancy, not showy, just deeply lived in. We bought it within a week. Strange things started within the first month. Subtle things at first. Lights flickering in the guest studio. Our dog, Clover, refusing to walk down the hallway past the master bedroom, even though she'd been perfectly fine with it during the first few days. Natalie was the first to say it out loud. "Do you ever feel like we're being watched?" I laughed it off. I told her it was probably the adjustment of moving, a change in elevation, or maybe a residual smell from the home's previous tenants that unsettled her. But at night, when the kids were asleep and the house fell silent, I knew what she meant. There was a presence. Not hostile, but lingering. Like someone was always a few steps behind you, or just around the corner in the kitchen, breathing quietly. One night, I found the television on downstairs. The old built-in set Fred had reportedly insisted on keeping despite upgrades. It was tuned to some old black-and-white sitcom rerun. I chalked it up to the kids or the remote glitching. But then it happened again. And again. Always late at night. Always the same shows: Father Knows Best, The Dick Van Dyke Show, and once even an obscure Fred Willard sketch from the 70s. We didn't have access to that content. None of it was on our streaming apps. That little studio in the back, the one Fred had used to write, became something of a problem. I'd intended to turn it into a home office. I brought my laptop and set up a desk, a lamp, and a comfortable chair. Within 10 minutes of sitting down for the first time, my laptop crashed. Not froze, crashed. Hard reset. Then the power went out in just that building. It happened again 2 days later, this time when Natalie tried to use it as an art space. Her Bluetooth speaker started playing audio clips of an old sitcom laugh track, over and over again, like a record skipping. She brought the speaker back inside the main house, plugged it in, and it worked just fine. We had an electrician check the wiring. He found nothing wrong. "Everything here looks original but stable," he said. "No rodents, no moisture damage. Actually, it's in better shape than most places I check." When he left, I saw something in the studio window, a reflection I couldn't explain. It looked like a man's silhouette in the corner, wearing what I can only describe as an old-fashioned blazer. But when I turned, there was nothing there. It escalated in the fall. Natalie had gone to visit her sister in Sacramento. I stayed behind with the kids. It was a Friday night, around 11:30 p.m. The kids were asleep, and I was in bed, half watching a documentary on my tablet when I heard it. Laughter. Not from the TV. Not from the neighbors. It was inside the house. Not wild, horror movie laughter, more like a chuckle. Familiar. Warm but wrong. Like it didn't belong here anymore. I got up and walked slowly toward the kitchen. That's when the overhead lights flickered. The radio on the counter, one of those retro-styled Bluetooth units, turned on by itself. It was playing an old game show, something from the 60s. And then the voice, "Well now, that's a tough crowd," followed by more laughter. I recognized the voice. Fred's. I froze. The sound stopped abruptly. I stood there in the dark kitchen for what felt like an hour before forcing myself back to bed. Natalie returned home the next week. I didn't mention the laughter. I didn't need to. That very night, she woke up screaming. She'd seen someone in the hallway mirror, a man with slicked back hair and a bemused smile, just staring at her before vanishing. She described the same man I'd seen in the reflection of the studio window. She didn't know that story. I hadn't told her. I started digging. Through archives. Through interviews. I found a podcast where Fred's longtime friend mentioned something in passing. Fred never wanted to leave that house. Even toward the end, he'd say, "If I die, I'll haunt that guest studio before I give it up to some Hollywood influencer." It was a joke, of course. Everyone laughed. But now we weren't laughing. We still live here. For now. We've learned to accept the presence. We don't disturb the studio anymore, we keep it closed. The door creaks open on its own sometimes, and we hear the faint sound of laughter or applause drifting in from it. But we no longer try to fix it. Some houses just aren't meant to be silenced. Some spirits aren't angry, they're just not finished performing. Fred always knew how to own a room. Now it seems he owns one more. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. It had rained the night before that rare, momentary storm that sometimes rolls in off the coast and surprises Los Angeles like an overdue apology. The smell of wet eucalyptus and concrete drifted through the canyons. That morning, around 6:15 a.m., I was standing barefoot on the back patio, a mug of coffee in one hand, Clover sniffing the puddles in the flagstone cracks. There was something about the house in those hours, before the city stirred, that made the edges feel thinner, like reality was a soft wall of fog you could pass your hand through if you were only brave enough. That's when I noticed the vent. It was low to the ground, rusted and barely visible beneath a tangle of ivy that curled along the rear wall of the house. I'd walked past it dozens of times, but that morning wet air, brittle light, it caught my eye. The pattern of bricks around it didn't match the rest of the foundation. They were older, darker, some of them flaking at the corners. I stepped closer. It wasn't just a vent. It was a hatch. A small, square door, maybe 2 feet high and wide, painted over a dozen times and forgotten. I crouched down, set my mug on the patio, and tugged gently at the rusted latch. To my surprise, it moved. The door opened with a reluctant groan, revealing a pitch-black cavity beneath the house. Not a crawl space deeper than that. Deeper and cooler. The air that rolled out smelled of dry paper and something sour, like old film reels or mildew on theater curtains. I reached for my phone, turned on the flashlight, and leaned forward. Stairs. Not full-size ones. Shallow, short steps made of poured concrete, descending into a darkness that absorbed the beam of light almost entirely. Natalie didn't believe me at first. "There's no basement in the blueprints," she said later that day. She had spread out the original house plans on the kitchen table, her finger tracing the bottom perimeter of the house. "See? Just slab. No indication of a substructure." But I wasn't imagining it. I took a photo, even showed her the hatch, now slightly ajar again despite my having closed it earlier. She stared into it like she was trying to convince herself it wasn't real. That night she dreamed of it. I knew because I woke to the sound of her whispering not to me, but to someone else. Her side of the bed was cold. She was standing by the bedroom window, arms folded tightly, eyes open but unfocused. "They're watching rehearsals again," she whispered. But he didn't like the punchline. When I touched her shoulder, she jerked like someone pulled her out of a pool. She didn't remember the dream, only that she had heard music playing beneath the floorboards, something jazzy, off-tempo, followed by what sounded like studio applause. I couldn't stop thinking about the basement. I returned to it the next afternoon when Natalie and the kids were out shopping. It felt like a compulsion, something gnawed gently at the back of my thoughts until I gave in. I armed myself with a heavy flashlight, a jacket, and gloves, then crouched back down to the hatch. The stairs creaked under my weight, but they held. Dust fell in little clouds from the ceiling as I moved. At the bottom, I found a single room. Small. No more than 15 feet wide in either direction. Walls made of untreated concrete, darkened with age and speckled with patches of black mold. But what stopped me, what froze me, was what sat in the middle of the floor. A stool, a microphone, and a narrow backdrop of deep red curtains nailed to a wooden frame. There were no cameras, no chairs for an audience, just the unmistakable geometry of a comedy set, the kind you'd see in smoky nightclubs or black box theaters. The stool was old but intact. A scuff mark on the floor in front of it, maybe from pacing. The microphone wasn't plugged in, just standing there on its skinny silver pole like it was waiting. As I took a step closer, the air grew warmer. Not just warmer hot like standing under stage lights. My skin began to prickle with sweat. And then, for a moment, the silence broke. A voice, soft, dry, full of amused disappointment. "No one ever waits for the callback, do they?" came from behind the curtain. I froze. The flashlight flickered once. Then the heat vanished, sucked away like a gasp. When I pulled back the curtain, my hands trembling, there was nothing there. But I didn't feel alone. Later that week, Natalie insisted we call a contractor. Not for the ghost, for the black mold in the substructure. We both agreed we didn't want to expose the kids to anything dangerous. The contractor came on Thursday morning. A tall man named Ruiz with arms like tree trunks and a voice so low it practically vibrated. He didn't last 20 minutes. He came up from the basement pale and silent, sweat beading on his forehead despite the morning chill. "Did you find anything?" I asked. Ruiz wiped his hands on his shirt. "There's something sealed into the west wall," he said. "Behind the cement. Looked like wood. Maybe a box. But I'm not messing with it." That night I went down alone again. I found the wooden panel he'd mentioned. It was hidden behind a false wall that had begun to flake. The texture was rough, like plywood. It took a crowbar and a steady hand to open it. Inside were dozens of letters. Handwritten. Yellowed. Addressed to no one. Just page after page of Fred Willard's unmistakable cursive. Setups, punchlines, notes about delivery. Stage directions. All scrawled in looping, hurried ink. At the bottom of some pages, written in red, "Never got the laugh I wanted." Natalie and I spent days reading them. Some of the material was brilliant, funny, biting, clever. Some was strange, personal, melancholic. Like he wasn't writing for an audience anymore, but for himself. Or someone who stopped listening a long time ago. We haven't gone back down there since. But the house has changed. Sometimes, when we walk into the living room, the scent of stage makeup hangs in the air, faint, powdery. The lights still flicker at 11:30 on the dot. And sometimes, when we're alone in the kitchen, we hear the distant sound of someone rehearsing lines pacing softly on a concrete floor beneath our feet. The studio in the back? The door swings open now on its own. And inside, taped to the wall, we found something new last week. A sheet of paper. Typed. Fresh. Just 4 words. "Is this thing on?" The paper on the wall stayed there for days. Natalie didn't want to touch it. She said it felt like removing it would be like talking over someone's punchline, disrespectful. I left it too. And yet, even as we tried to ignore it, something about those 4 words, "Is this thing on?" pulled at both of us like a thread we weren't supposed to tug. I spent most of the next week in a kind of half-existence, going through the motions of my job, my family duties, but never fully present. I would wake up at night thinking I'd heard footsteps in the gravel outside, soft and uneven, like someone pacing back and forth behind the guest studio. Clover wouldn't bark, only lift her head slowly, eyes glassy and uncertain, as though unsure whether she was sensing a sound or just remembering one. It all came to a head when the power went out. It was a Thursday night, warm, with low clouds blanketing the hills. Around 9:40 p.m., as Natalie was loading the dishwasher and I was flipping through Netflix, the house went entirely dark. No warning, no flicker, just sudden, dense silence. I walked to the window. The neighbor's porch lights were still on. This was not a blackout. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way out the back door toward the breaker panel beside the guest studio. The air was still, dead still. Not even the rustle of eucalyptus leaves or the distant hum of traffic down in the canyon. Just the heavy quiet of something watching and waiting. As I approached the panel, I noticed the door to the guest studio had opened again, wide this time, not the usual slow drift. I paused. The beam of my flashlight slid across the threshold and stopped on something new. A small, black box sitting in the center of the floor. A tape recorder, old-fashioned. The kind with chunky buttons and a plastic handle, probably from the early 80s. A reel-to-reel tape already loaded. The clear plastic window fogged slightly, as if someone had just been holding it in warm hands. There was a note beneath it, typed in the same font as the paper from before. This one said, "Rewind before listening. Please. Timing is everything." I hesitated, then reached for the device. It was warm, warmer than anything in the studio should have been. I clicked rewind. The reel spun slowly, whining just a little. Then click. I pressed play. What came out was not what I expected. Not a voice. Not a performance. It was breathing. Slow. Deep. Measured. The way someone breathes when they're alone in a room before going on stage. Then a whisper. "I used to kill in this room." A soft chuckle followed. Then silence for a few seconds before a different sound emerged, the unmistakable murmur of a crowd settling into seats. Then laughter. Not recorded laughter, not a laugh track. Real. Organic. The kind that ripples across a small audience when something genuinely unexpected is said. But I had said nothing. There was no one in the room but me. I turned off the tape and stood still for a long time. Outside, something moved behind the studio. A shadow against shadows. Long slouched, like a man who had spent decades in front of people and had forgotten how to stand tall when alone. The next few days were strange. It wasn't just the odd noises or flickering lights anymore. Now the house felt off. Crooked, like the angles didn't add up. Doors no longer aligned perfectly with their frames. The hallway seemed longer. One morning, Natalie swore she saw a light on in the basement, a faint glow, like a red stage light, seeping up through the slats in the pantry floor, even though we'd sealed that hatch with screws after the mold scare. More troubling were the voices. Not shouts, not screams, nothing like that, just lines, repeated over and over again, softly, like someone rehearsing dialogue behind the walls. "Let's take it from the top. Too soon. No, wait for it. Wait for it. I was married once, but then again, so was everyone." Laughter. It became clear to us that Fred hadn't left the house at all. He had, in fact, deepened his presence. Whatever tether had kept him attached to this place, it was strengthening. Or maybe we were simply becoming more attuned to the frequency he'd always been operating on. That idea terrified me more than ghosts, because it meant we weren't just haunted, we were audience. I went back to the letters in the false wall beneath the house. There was one I hadn't read. Tucked in the very back of the stack, protected in a yellowed envelope, it was dated 2014, 6 years before Fred passed. It wasn't like the others. No punchlines. No crowd notes. It was a confession. He wrote about how the laughter had become a kind of drug, how even after the cameras stopped rolling and the lights dimmed, he could still hear the applause in his head. At first, he thought it was a gift, a leftover thrill from years of performance. But it had changed. He began to hear it late at night, from the guest studio, long after he'd gone to bed. Sometimes it was distant, sometimes right outside his door. He wrote, "I think I built this place too well. It's like I laid out a stage for something that refuses to close the show. I should have torn it down, but now it's all that listens." At the bottom of the page, one line had been added in thick, angry ink. "There's no such thing as a final act." I didn't show that letter to Natalie. Not yet. That night, we heard the applause again, this time louder than ever. It started in the living room, moved through the hallway like a tide, then finally quieted under the floor beneath our bed. Somewhere in that silence, a voice whispered from beneath the house, "Stay with me, just until I get the timing right." We sold the house 3 weeks later. Natalie couldn't sleep. The kids were hearing things. Clover stopped going near the guest studio entirely, would whine and scratch at the door to be let inside whenever we stepped into the backyard. And me? I started dreaming in black and white, as if I were living inside someone else's rerun. The same laugh track. The same stage. Always empty seats. On the last night, I went down to the basement alone. I had to. The mic was still there. The stool. The curtain. But this time, someone had left something for me, a single sheet of paper on the floor. Typed, "Thank you for being such a good audience. Most people don't stay through the credits." I stood there for a long time. Then the mic sparked to life. The light over the set buzzed on, soft and pink like a dying sunset. One last voice. Exit stage left. I turned, walked up the stairs, and never looked back. The house was bought by a young couple in production Hollywood types. Enthusiastic. We didn't warn them. Maybe we should have. But then again, Fred always loved a fresh crowd. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.